Hi there, and welcome to the Main Idea podcast. I am Jenn David-Lang, and my passion is helping school leaders learn. On this podcast, I typically share great education and leadership books, but I also come across practitioners and thought leaders and bring them on to share their excellent ideas with you for your school or your district. So today, I am excited to introduce you to Lori McEwen. Lori has a long history in the field of education. She has held leadership roles as both assistant superintendent and chief academic officer. And now she's a researcher, a consultant, teaches in an ed leadership doctoral program, is writing a book. Maybe she'll tell us about. I met Lori several years ago when we were both learning together in a mastermind group, which is a way to engage in professional learning with a group of leaders. As many of you know, I run a mastermind group with school and district leaders myself. But when I was in this mastermind group with Lori, I always found her to be very joyful and always put students at the center of whatever comment she was making. And later I found out those are two areas of her work. She's done a lot of work around ensuring learning is joyful for students. And she definitely right now supports schools and districts to develop a very student-centered vision in the form of a portrait of a graduate. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So welcome, Lori, my joyful and student-centered friend.
Thank you so much for that intro, Jen. Now I don't have to say anything about myself. You covered it all, but I will say for those listening, the Mutual Admiration Society is here. I've always loved working with you and learning from you and the service that you provide to leaders through the Main Idea and this podcast. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. And there's a lot more to you, right? We are 3D people. We could probably talk for a long time. We'll see how we can weave it all in. So we're going to talk about this concept of the portrait of a graduate.
Yeah.
So for those of you new to that idea and you're picturing some like stuffy hall with lots of beautiful pictures of our 12th grade students, what exactly is a portrait of a graduate and what problems does it address?
That's a great question. And so, yeah, no stuffy portraits of our 12th graders. In fact, if you Google portrait of a graduate, you sometimes come up with, picture taking companies for students, but that's not what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's called a vision of a graduate, a vision of a learner profile, a graduate profile. So there are all of these different terms. But in a nutshell, it is a community created document that solidifies the skills, habits, and dispositions that we want our students to have, largely for the future. And so that's what it is. And you can find them on many websites. We can talk a little bit more about what it usually consists of. But the history comes from the world of business, really. So the first portrait that we can find, that I can find, goes to the state of South Carolina in 2012. But Tony Wagner was talking about this, and I'm sure you know Tony well. In the Global Achievement Gap, he pointed out his conversations with business leaders and what they were saying their employees did not have. And, sort of the implication being that they weren't taught or had developed what Wagner then called the 7 essential skills. And so it came largely as a response to how do we prepare students for this VUCA, volatile, uncertain world. But to my mind, and this is an important thread that I'll weave through and it won't surprise you, the portrait is not just what we aspire to for our future graduates, for when they go on to college, career, or civic life, but it's the way we want to engage with their learning today. I'll stop in a second, but I'll leave you with, one of my favorite quotes from Dewey: education is not preparation for life, it is life itself. So the portrait of a graduate is what we'd like to see happen when they walk across the stage, who they are and the skills they carry with them. But as we develop it, we do it with an eye towards who they are today.
I love that sort of backwards approach,
Yeah.
meaning that like business leaders said, "Hey, we're getting a bunch of 20 somethings and they're not prepared
Right.
to work in the workplace." Now, were they talking about business specific skills or more general interpersonal skills or learning to learn, or what kinds of skills were they talking about?
Sort of all of that. And So if we think about portraits, most that I've seen or helped to construct develop skills in three areas:
Mm.
cognitive, interpersonal, and intrapersonal, right? What business leaders, I think, were saying, and probably what we would see if we look just even at civic discourse today,
Mhm.
are some of what are known as soft skills or durable skills or career skills. So, the four most prevalent skills are communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and creativity or creative thinking. Those are the four C's from the Partnership for 21st Century Learning. If we map them against, and I have Wagner's seven essential skills, if we map them against the Hewlett Foundation's deeper learning framework, if we map them against the CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning framework, you see pieces of all of this. And so, but largely, yes, businesses were saying folks don't know how to apply their learning. They don't know how to solve problems that didn't exist in their textbook. I'm oversimplifying.
Mhm.
They don't necessarily know how to collaborate on a team.
Mhm.
Those kinds of things, the way that when you're solving a sticky problem, you have to bring your whole self to it. And it's not the same way that you bring yourself to a multiple choice exam. So they were saying even students who had been very successful
Mhm.
in school, in terms of their standardized assessments or their GPA, right? There were these bright, shining academic stars, might not be able to then assimilate into a workplace to work with others and solve problems.
Yeah. So it sounds like there's sort of two areas, one, um, it's sort of kids lacking adaptive skills versus technical, right? So
Yes.
so they're able to solve problems they've solved before. So if you go to a workplace and they have you, factor a quadratic equation, then you're all
Right,
set, right?
right, right,
So part of it is like solving new problems, whether those are actual problems at work or problems dealing with
right,
people, and I have a 20 something daughter who's telling me about, workplace dynamics. And so I get that. And then some of it is falls into that category of what we would call transfer learning, right? So you learn it within these four walls of the school building. And, in schools, we often mean, can you transfer it, from math to English or from ninth grade to 10th grade? But here, like,
right,
can you transfer it from sitting in a classroom, probably literally like sitting in a desk often,
right.
to a workplace? And so, it seems like all those other the 21st century learning, the C's, the WAG, all these other types of skills. It's not just, the business community, but there's been an awareness that we're not fully preparing students for the world out
Yes.
there. So how is a portrait of a graduate different from the other ones that you mentioned? Why didn't Tony Wagner just, grab, well, we've got these 21st century learning skills.
Well, I think he did.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of folks, when I was an assistant superintendent, we really built a lot of our goals and our work and our strategic planning we backward mapped to the Hewlett Foundation's deeper learning framework. And that was what I knew at the time.
Mm.
One of the things that I think makes the portrait different and special is that we are not talking about skills, an abstract thing, right? We're not talking about competencies, an abstract thing. We're talking about the learner, the graduate. So take the graduate and put your 20 something daughter's face in there, put your own in there. Take a little 5-year-old who's starting kindergarten. And so I think there's something about putting the learner at the center of this, putting the graduate, the child, the student at the center that humanizes it. At least that's what I think. I've not researched why
Mm.
this is more compelling than any of the others, but I did recently complete a research study about the impact of the portrait on classroom instruction. Right. Truth be told, I'd helped a lot of districts create one, even start to unpack it and implement it. But I just wasn't sure that it was translating into changes in teaching and learning and classroom instruction.
Yes.
And so Scott McLeod and I, my colleague Scott McLeod, um, and if you haven't done any of his books, I will definitely give you titles because they're worth reading. Scott and I investigated. We talked to 15 districts across the country at all different stages. One had had a portrait for 7 years. One was in second year implementation. We talked to a whole bunch of them. But to come back to the question of why this is resonating, I had one superintendent in the study who said in 32 years, this was the most excited she'd been about any initiative. And it was the most excited she had seen the people who worked with her be about anything. And I think it really is about humanizing in that way. It would be worth investigating, but that's my hypothesis right now.
Is that what connected you to the work personally, like your own passion and interest in the topic?
100%.
Yeah.
So, I came to this, Jen, when I was an assistant superintendent. Before that, as you said, chief academic officer. I don't recall knowing the term portrait of a graduate.
Mm.
And I remember being like intellectually in love. I'll use Hewlett over and over again, but it started with Tony Wagner's book, really.
Mm.
It was, and I've always been in love with the idea of doing school differently so that we can really engage and inspire and spark learners and learners' love of learning. You and I have talked about this before. I 100% believe that students can love school every single day. No student should ever say, I hate school. So that's how I came to it,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
But, when you bring different frameworks in front of people, it doesn't always translate. And so when I started seeing folks who were really jumping on, I'm working with districts and I'm working with groups of teachers, and we are trying to operationalize the portrait through taking each competency like collaboration and breaking it into progressions, and I can statements and what does that look like at each grade level. I've seen people really excited about, curriculum development. Some people might be rolling their eyes as they say, but I have seen that when people really love their content, right?
Yeah.
I've seen that, but not to the extent that I saw folks willing to debate with one another about does this I can statement make it into it? Do we
Mhm.
see this in our curriculum already? There was something about it that sort of brought all of the thinking that I had done and all of the work that I've loved for so long that sometimes I faced resistance to as a leader. It seemed to resonate with folks a little bit differently. And so, yes, and that again, as you said, student-centered learning has been at the forefront of the decisions I've tried to make as a leader, or the decisions I've made. I've tried to have them be influenced that way.
That's
And
funny
this
that you
this
said
resonated.
as a chief academic officer, you sort of had the concept before the words or the term portrait of a graduate. I remember being quite young, and there was a PD activity where teachers took out newsprint on the floor and drew like, sort of a bubble figure of a student graduating. And
Yes.
we were, writing down like what skills, other than this wasn't the time to get into the, writing a good, using evidence in your essay, but this was, what other types of skills, dispositions, habits would we want in students who graduated, well, for their heart, for their mind, for their,
Yes.
and so this seems like a way where it's written for you. So I
Hmm.
guess my question is, so about the operationalizing, right?
Sure.
So if and by the way, I'm in New York, and our state adopted the New York State Portrait of a Graduate just this past July for the very
Yes.
first class who are graduating in 2009.
Yes.
So well, first of all, what does that mean? So does that mean like if there's a 12th grader in New York who's missing one of these skills, they don't graduate? Like, what does it mean to adopt it exactly?
I wish I had an answer for you on that because I don't. I've not yet worked with a place where the portrait itself is high stakes.
Okay.
So Massachusetts, which is the next state over from me, they just unveiled their portrait.
Okay.
And similar to what New York did. So New York has this as an option, an
Mhm.
optional sort of replacement to the Regents exam. If I understand it correctly, I might be wrong. Um, Massachusetts just did away with their high stakes MCAS
Mm,
exam.
that's huge.
And then shortly after that,
Yeah.
unveiled the portrait.
Okay.
Now, what they may do with that is say a graduation requirement might be for students to have to demonstrate via a portfolio, a capstone assessment, a senior project, the ways in which they have developed these competencies.
Okay.
But I certainly hope that we never get to a place where any external figure, a teacher, a parent, a principal, a state commissioner, is looking at a student and saying, well, Jenn, because you're a 2.2 level communicator, you can't graduate from high school.
Right.
I hope we are never,
Yeah.
ever saying that. And I think that is, something I've started to worry about. With you take something that is meant to
Hmm.
help students become more engaged in their learning and help educators be more excited about
Yeah.
pedagogy and
Hmm.
projects and instruction.
Yep.
And if we make this too efficient,
Yep.
or if we make this a replacement for these high stakes exam because we just can't get out of this paradigm that you must have such a thing,
Yeah.
I think that sullies the portrait.
Yeah.
So it is my hope that it is not done that way. I don't know that it will be, but I do hear people
Yeah.
and they're asking me about it. How can we assess this? And they mean, how can I as an adult assess the child as a learner
Hmm.
on these skills and then grade it or mark it in some way rather than provide some feedback?
Yeah.
I could go on forever about this, but I'll just say these skills in the portrait, if it's done well and they don't all look the same, we can talk about that if you'd like. But if this is done well, these skills are skills that students are developing their entire lives. What we're trying to do is make them metacognitive about them.
Yes.
We're trying to build in as many opportunities as possible authentically for students to develop them. We want them to assess their own growth, but not because they were told to or they can't, move forward. We want to give them feedback. We want it to be the ethos of the culture. We want teachers talking to each other this way. We want school board members interacting using these dispositions.
Yeah.
That's what we want. And it is quite fine to be 17 or 18 and to not have honed your collaboration skills to the extent that you might when you're 55.
I'm
That
still
is,
working on them. Yeah.
and we laugh, but we all are. And I think that's another challenge to this. I may not have all of the communication skills I wish I had. And so I might be a little bit nervous about my role
Right.
in helping somebody else to do it, but
Right.
I might be very strong in my knowledge of physics and I want to sort of stay in my
Sure.
lane.
Sure.
So we
Hide
can,
behind the physics. Yeah. Yeah.
we can,
No, so
hi,
let's,
yeah,
yeah, go
go
ahead. Yeah.
ahead.
Yeah, no, I
No, no,
want to
no.
get into so some of the practicality. Well, first of all, for
Yeah,
anyone who's tuned out because they're an elementary leader or middle school,
yeah,
first of all, like, are there portraits of a graduate for middle school kids, for elementary kids, or is it back mapped from 12th grade? So first is the what, like the
yeah.
what does this look like for 12th, 11th, 10th, 8th, 5th, 2nd. So where does the what live, or are
Mhm.
schools or districts creating it? Is my first question. Yeah.
So how are schools and districts creating? Is that what you're,
The what skills does this mean for a seventh grader? What skills does this mean for a ninth grader? What skills does this mean? The progressions that you had mentioned
yeah.
earlier. Are schools mapping them out themselves, or do they exist, or?
Often not. When I have worked with districts, especially when I've worked with, say, smaller 2 to 5,000 student districts, where we can have the principal of the middle school and the principal of the elementary school and the principal of the high school and some teachers from each level together on a steering committee. We're
Mm,
collaboratively talking about the
okay.
skills that are necessary. We have an eye towards the future in the same way that with our content standards, we have an eye towards the future, right? And some of these overlap. Some of those skills, we'll talk about communication a lot, but you see that in the Common Core state standards and however those have been adapted by each state, whatever they need to call them right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
You see problem solving and creative thinking in our science standards. And so we see these things. And so what we try to do is say overarching, right? By the time somebody graduates, we would want to know that they are, if not fully developed, they have really honed these skills we've given them opportunities to.
Mhm.
And then what schools do, schools and districts will do is create, again, those progressions,
Mhm.
I can statements
Mhm.
that the student can use,
Mhm.
but also then the language that teachers can use to say, okay, we think this is what that looks like
Mm.
in seventh grade.
Gotcha.
And so we will design learning activities,
Mhm.
feedback, and instruction to that level. The same way if we take some of those skills that vertically articulate or spiral through content level and we parse those out for each level.
So I'm hearing that what's important is for the teachers to phrase those and work through the process of prioritizing and choosing and phrasing it in ways that work for them so that they own it. It's not handed down like a scripted curriculum or something.
Right. And I would say that that's a both and. We
Yeah.
want teachers to help to develop
Yeah.
those progressions and competencies, but we also want some level of shared calibration or
Right.
understanding about them at each level. So often I'm working with teams rather than individual teachers. Those teams can then work in a professional learning community, so on and so forth. But you're absolutely right. It's teachers understand developmentally what these skills should look like at each
They're grade
level.
levels. So if that's the what, like what skills, then what about the how? So let's say I'm a seventh grade teacher and I've worked with my team and we have agreed that, one of the skills is toward collaboration is I can acknowledge and build on the ideas of others, right?
Yes.
Let's
Yeah.
say. So
Yeah.
then how, as a teacher, where is my guidance in how I teach that to my seventh grade class?
Well, that guidance is exactly what I'm trying to develop for schools and districts to make
Yeah.
a little bit easier.
Yeah.
What I would say is I would hate for this to just fall on the shoulders of the individual teacher. I now have to parse out what that means
Right.
and change my instruction accordingly.
Right.
You've given a really great example though with that, I can understand and reflect on the thoughts of
Build
others,
on the ideas
build
of
upon.
others. Yeah.
Thank you. I was actually literally just talking to a superintendent about an hour ago about this.
Yeah.
And so um, in her district, like in many others, they're using, she didn't call it this, but like accountable talk
Mhm.
stems.
Yeah.
Many of us use those,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Many of us will have our kids engage in a turn and talk. You see it all the time.
Mhm.
The typical turn and talk is 30 seconds.
Yep.
Um, and then when we say, can you share out? Lori shares out what Lori said rather than Lori sharing out what she and
Right.
Jenn together discussed
Sure.
or giving Jenn any recognition
Yeah.
or saying that Jenn changed her mind.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let me just keep sharing. It becomes like that sandbox playing, right? Parallel play for
Parallel
little
play.
kids.
Yeah.
So there are strategies like the turn and talk that teachers are already using that we, people like me and others, can help, or their district leaders, instructional coaches can help us to be a little bit more intentional. Let's take that turn and talk and call it a turn talk paraphrase. There's probably a better
Mhm.
term at younger ages, right?
Yeah.
But now I intentionally want you to say, here's what my partner said. Here's
Mhm.
where my partner and I disagreed.
Mhm.
My partner and I were talking about this and couldn't get to it, so we went over to the group
Mhm.
behind us.
Mhm.
Now, to do that, you have to understand that a turn and talk isn't 30 seconds. You have
Right.
to, there will be some changes to what maybe might be comfortable in your instruction to open it up. That's a small example, but um, teachers do need help and support to see what they're doing, right? You take like Ron Richart has that model of, create and amplify and modify. There are things that we can amplify,
Yeah.
things that we can modify that we're doing, and there will be some things that we might have to delete because they're practices that simply do not hone
Yeah.
any of these skills. But we probably know what those are already.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it sounds like, right, so this isn't happening in like, advisory period or portrait of a graduate period, right? These are skills that are infused, I assume, within the regular classroom setting.
So,
No.
Jen, we're talking about what is happening and maybe what we'd like to have happening, and
Okay,
they're
so
two
what's the
different
ideal?
things.
Is it woven in, or do you have, fourth period as my portrait of a graduate period?
No, the ideal, and in the article, Scott and I have, and I can send you the pre-publication article, but based on the study, we've developed an alignment continuum, right? What's symbolic
Yeah.
implementation and what's transformative implementation. So when we're getting to levels of substantial or transformative transformation, it's in the curriculum. Every time we do a curriculum revision,
Mm.
we say not only how are we developing the content standards, right?
Yeah.
Using usually UBD.
Mhm.
How will students transfer this? But how do the learning activities and projects that we're designing around this that are authentic also help students to develop these competencies to different extents within each project and each subject area? And how will they have time to reflect on those?
Mhm.
So let's just do that in the curriculum cycle, but they can and should be woven in the same way we take all of our priority standards and we pull those into our curriculum maps.
I wonder if there's
Um,
also an opportunity though beyond curriculum, because when I think of curriculum, I think of either separate grades for elementary or separate subject areas. And it
yep,
seems like some of these types of portrait of a graduate skills are cross content area and cross grades. So it seems like it's an opportunity for real, professional learning and focus across the school, bringing people together.
100%, right? And that's why I think they might be more apparent in schools that are able to be uh, more innovative, more progressive with some of those structures, with some of their scheduling structures. You know, these skills work together, and these skills, let's say with the 4 C's, because they're so prevalent, but we often have citizenship, empathy, resilience, some other skills. There's usually 5 6 um, competencies in the portrait, and as I said, most of them have those 4 C's in them, and then there's room for again, citizenship comes up a lot, global contributor, those kinds of things that might be important to a community. Some of those lend themselves very well to the curriculum as we have it, but some might be sort of a thematic culminating event or ongoing project or whatever it might be. And those schools that can sort of blur the lines between subject area, grade levels, probably have a better opportunity to go deeper, but it can be woven into what we have now within the current structure. So it should be woven in. I think it can be woven in, but lots of places are doing advisory. They're, doing the POG of the week, student of
Hmm.
the week. So I caught you
Yeah.
doing something
Yeah.
aligned to this in the hallway on the football field. And all of that is good as a start,
Yeah.
good as one of the practices. But the bulk of what happens for students happens in the classroom. It happens in teaching and learning. And so it really does have to get and these are important for learning.
Yeah.
So it has to be brought in there.
Right, right. These support the traditional learning in the classroom too.
Exactly.
Are you seeing any ways that students or families are involved in either the development of the portrait of a graduate? And I like, of course, you're in the field of education, you already have an acronym, POGs.
Yeah.
So have you seen students or families be involved either with the development of it or the implementation of it in any way?
Both. So, and you can cut me off at any time because I go really long on some of these answers. Um, when I've worked with others as well to help develop them, usually a steering committee and or surveys and or focus groups involve as many different stakeholders as possible.
Mm.
So that's important. One I did in Connecticut last year, we had some great students and they brought the work of the steering committee to their groups and got feedback. And I went and interviewed whole bunches of kids in 4th grade and 5th grade. So there's that. But then when you get to the implementation piece, there are some strategies and approaches that folks are using. One of the places that has been doing this the longest, and they weren't in my study, but I've worked with them, is Fairfax, Virginia. And now they're huge,
Mm-hmm.
huge.
Mm-hmm.
But they've had what they call Portrait of a Graduate for many years. The state of Virginia has one as well. And so, gosh, it was over 10 years, maybe 2 years ago. So maybe it's about 12 years. And they do what they call POG poll, Portrait of a Graduate Presentations of Learning. There's an acronym for you,
Pogpole,
right?
POG, Portrait of a Graduate, Presentation of
Presentations of
Learning.
Learning.
Okay.
And in those, students are presenting
Mm.
their learning about the competencies and their content. And, we got to witness some of these with fourth graders talking about how they had developed some of these skills and their experiences with it. It was beautiful. And high school kids were doing that as well. So that's one way. And then you bring the community into those presentations or those capstone projects, kind of like what Debbie Meyer was doing years ago and
Sure.
with
Exhibitions, Ted
graduation by
Sizer.
exhibition.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, Ted Sizer in the essential schools. I did work at an essential school for a while. Um, but also one of the best practices I think is student-led conferences. So
Mm.
taking something that we do anyway, a night that we have set apart, a day that we have set apart,
Yeah.
and flipping them over and having them be student-led. That creates agency, but we're also allowing the students to talk about how they're developing themselves as this,
Yes.
graduate, as this learner, along with their content skills. Bring the family in, and now the family is engaged with understanding that that's how we talk about learning
Yes.
in this district. And so that's one approach that I'm seeing.
No, that's great. No, and I've seen student-led conferences where, students don't have the vocabulary. They're talking about, I did well on this multiplication test, or I did, as opposed to like, I learned how to more critically read a piece of writing to determine if it's, false or true, or some of these other skills I think are a little
Right,
um, more useful to talk about in a more learning focused way. So that's
right.
great
And
to
then
bring it into that. Yeah.
you're not saying I'm good at math or I'm not good at math. You're saying when I get to collaborate with others and test my ideas and my thinking,
Yeah.
I have found that I do better
Yeah.
in math or I do better learning math. And so weaving those together, which is just talking about how we learn metacognition.
Yeah. So have you seen any results so far? If, there's a leader listening who hasn't tried this, doesn't want to add another initiative to their plate, what kinds of results or benefits have you seen so far?
So I think the benefits have really been around student agency, right?
Mm.
And so when places have really embedded this work deeply, right? Now go to, Fairfax is one of them that has been doing it for so long. But I had some in my study, and we're keeping all of those names confidential right now. But um, you see students really owning their learning, which is what we said we want, right? Um, and, in terms of have I looked at it against sort of standardized assessments? No, I haven't done that work, and I don't know if individual districts have, but it's definitely elevating the level of discourse
Mm.
among students about learning. And I would say for teachers and educators as well, because it puts more of a focus on how students are learning and how they're approaching the learning and how they're developing as learning. So we saw, and I won't belabor the study, but we saw a range of results of implementation. Some of it staying at that poster on a wall, some of it where folks were really trying to bring the portrait to life, but it was staying on what I call parallel tracks, or one of my participants actually called parallel tracks. So we talk about the portrait in advisory, but we don't talk about it in English class. And then in a few places where it's really been woven in and it leads up to a senior capstone, sometimes an eighth grade capstone, a fifth grade capstone. And what you see there, as one of our participants told us, is not a dry eye in the house, because students are talking about their learning, their experiences, themselves as learners. And I think that's really what we want.
Yeah. No, it's very exciting to me. I mean, I think it's really what we need now more than ever. Obviously we're going down the AI path,
Hmm.
and it's more important than ever for our students to develop those uniquely human skills, right? So a
Yes.
lot of these are about human skills.
Yes.
And I recently finished Zaretta Hammond's new book about rebuilding students' learning power. And it's really about how do we take dependent learners and compliance-based education and move our students more towards independent learners, and really, the skills that our students are going to need. There's this line, it's like AI is not going to take your job, but someone who knows how to use AI is going to take your job,
Right.
right?
Right.
But for students, it's they need to learn how to learn because
Mhm.
we really don't know what jobs may look like in 4 or 5 years. So they have to learn how to learn. And what is learning how to learn? It's a lot of these types of, metacognition and other skills that you're talking about. So this seems very timely from what I can tell.
Yeah,
Um,
I think so.
yeah. I want to end with a quick lightning round of three quick questions so that
Okay.
people leave with something very concrete. If you could share one first step, if a school or district is new to this work or their state hasn't adopted it, what's a first step they could take if they like this idea of moving their students toward a portrait of a graduate? A pitfall, what's a common pitfall to avoid if you do this work? And then a resource if someone wants to learn more about this type of work.
Yeah, so I think if I were a leader, my first step would be to start with purpose. And I think I would ask the community in a number of different ways. You can do a survey, you can do it at your staff meetings, who they want their young people to become. And you can ask them to, put up to 3 to 5 adjectives that describe what you want and put that together in sort of a community wordle, if you will.
Yeah.
And you'll see the overlaps, you'll see what people want, and then start some discussions about, great, do we think we're providing that for our students? Do we think we're developing it? And if not, what we would like to do about that? So start with questions,
I
right?
love that. I love that.
Always start with questions.
Great first step.
Um,
Yep.
I think the pitfall is don't stop at the poster. I see a lot of folks making really great and beautiful posters. You don't have to go in the mindset that everything has to change immediately as a result of this, but you have to understand that this is not a survey of what we already do. This is aspirational and this can provide a North Star. And if it is a North Star giving us direction, we're going to be going on a journey and we have to be prepared for the
Mm,
steps along that journey.
okay.
And then you
A
asked for,
resource if people want to learn more. Yes.
so I would say come to me. So I would say visit my website at lorimcEwen.com. I am looking for people who want to talk about getting started or if they're stuck, why that is. And I'd love to just have a 20 to 30-minute conversation. I'll make all the tools and findings that come from that available to, they'll be public on my website as some are right now, but I'll also reach out to those folks who talk with me individually. So come my way, and if I don't have the answers, I will point you towards them.
Great. Well, I was going to ask how could people learn more about you? So LoriMcEwen.com, and I will put
Yes.
that in the show notes so it's spelled correctly.
Yes. Thank you.
So good. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your time. It's really exciting initiative. So I'm very excited about this. For those who are listening, if you got something out of this conversation, I'd appreciate it if you would share it with a colleague. That would be great. And I will be back in a few weeks. So until then, learn more, lead better.